Welcome. This case is Germanwings Flight 9525, the 24th of March 2015, in the French Alps. And I will say at the outset that it remains one of the most difficult cases in modern aviation to teach because it involves the deliberate act of a crew member. Please handle it with the seriousness it deserves. Our analytical purpose is captured in the title. A door built to protect became the instrument of the threat. This is a case about barrier analysis, about what happens when a safety barrier is designed against one threat model while the actual threat sits on the other side of it. And as we will see, it leaves behind a paradox that the industry has still not resolved. The sequence of events is brief and stark. During cruise from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, the captain left the flight deck. First Officer Andreas Lubitz, now alone, locked the reinforced cockpit door and selected a descent. That door, introduced across the fleet after September 11th, was engineered to be impenetrable from outside once locked from within. The captain's emergency access code could be, and was, overridden from inside. The aircraft descended continuously for around 10 minutes and was flown deliberately into terrain near the village of Le Vernet. All 150 people on board were killed. Note the structure of the tragedy. Every element of the security system functioned exactly as designed. That is what makes this a barrier analysis case, rather than a failure case. Here is the puzzle. How does a safety barrier become the weapon? The reinforced door performed flawlessly against its design threat. No external attacker could have breached that flight deck. But the threat that day was not external. It was already inside, seated at the controls, holding the lock switch. The principle this case teaches, in one sentence, is this: a barrier is only as good as the threat model it was designed against. Every defense embodies assumptions about where danger comes from. When reality violates those assumptions, the barrier does not merely fail to protect, it can actively serve the threat by sealing out the very people who could have intervened. Layer 1 of our analysis: the barrier itself. After 9/11, regulators worldwide mandated reinforced, lockable flight deck doors, and the design brief was unambiguous: keep hostile external actors out. Against that brief, the engineering was a complete success, but the threat model contained a silent assumption that everyone already on the flight deck is trustworthy. The insider threat, the pilot as the hazard, was simply outside the model. This is not a criticism of the engineers. It is an illustration of how threat models work. Ask your audience, what other barriers in their own operations carry unexamined assumptions about who the threat is? Layer 2, the latent conditions behind the door. Because the door only mattered on that day due to conditions that had been accumulating for years. First Officer Lubitz had a psychiatric history, including treatment for a severe depressive episode that was not visible to his employer at the time of the flight. The aeromedical system relied heavily on self-disclosure, and the incentives ran entirely against disclosing. A pilot who reveals a mental health condition risks his medical certificate, his career, and his identity. The BEA investigation found he had been declared unfit by a physician, and that this information never reached the airline. This is a silence built into the system, a structural non-disclosure norm produced not by individual dishonesty alone, but by the way the system priced honesty. The lesson generalizes far beyond aviation medicine. Layer 3, the compensating barrier and the paradox it created. The industry's immediate response was the two-person rule. Whenever one pilot leaves the flight deck, a second crew member enters, so that no one is ever alone at the controls. As a barrier, it addresses the insider threat directly. A second person can observe, question, and if necessary, physically intervene. But now bring this forward to the present day. Extended Minimum Crew Operations, EMCO, and single-pilot cruise concepts propose, by design, exactly the condition the two-person rule was created to prevent: one human, alone in a locked flight deck for hours at a time. The very isolation the industry legislated against after Germanwings is now being proposed as an efficiency measure. Let that tension register before we move on. We will not resolve it because the industry has not. The deeper mechanism stated plainly: a barrier is only as good as its threat model. The door closed the external attack path completely and left the insider path wide open. That is the general form of the lesson. Barriers do not have a level of strength in the abstract. They have strength against a specified threat and zero or negative strength against threats outside the specification. And the paradox on the right of the slide is the live edge of this case. The two-person rule exists to guarantee mutual monitoring, and EMCO deliberately removes it, betting instead on ground support, cockpit sensing, and automation. Whether those substitutes genuinely replace a second pair of eyes, for incapacitation, for deterioration, for intent, is one of the defining human factors questions of the coming decade. 3 lessons that outlive the case. First, check the threat model. For every barrier in your operation, ask not only what it defends against, but what it explicitly does not. The undefended path is where the next event comes from. Second, design and mutual monitoring. A second observer on the flight deck is not a courtesy. It is a core safety function that detects deteriorating behavior, incapacitation, or intent before it becomes irreversible. Any concept that removes the second observer must state what performs that function instead. Third, watch for reintroduced risk. Systems have institutional memory only if we maintain it. New operational concepts, EMCO is the standing example, can quietly recreate the precise vulnerability an earlier generation of barriers was built to close. The discipline is to trace every new concept against the accidents that shaped the current architecture. To close, Germanwings 9525 anchors. Chapter 12 of the book on human factors in ATM, airports and cabin operations, where the cabin flight deck security architecture is examined in full. The door, the two-person rule, aeromedical disclosure, and the EMCO paradox. The complete analysis appears in Aviation Human Factors, Theory, Research, and Applications for Advanced Aviation Systems, Ziakas and Peklavanis, CRC Press, 2026. Thank you. And given the sensitivity of this case, I am happy to take questions on either the analytical framework or the ongoing regulatory debate.